Hi everyone, and a warm welcome back to the French Culture Podcast by Paris Unlocked. I'm your host, Courtney Traub. If you're just tuning in for the first time, today's episode on Edith Piaf is part of a longer season that's exploring some of the great French icons of the 20th century, from Piaf to Henri Matisse, Albert Camus, Josephine Baker, and Serge Gainsbourg. I do recommend that you first listen to episode 3, Edith Piaf Part 1, so today's episode doesn't feel out of context. Before I get back to our two-part story on the life and legacy of France's most beloved diva, I'd like to ask you a small favor. Please share this episode with anyone you think might enjoy it. And if you can, please help the French Culture Podcast thrive and grow by donating whatever you can. Here's what you can do to support us. You can buy us a coffee via Ko-Fi by following the link in the show notes or on the podcast webpage. You can also become a donor subscriber at Substack, which will give you unlimited access to a large archive of Paris and France-related news stories, reviews, audio stories, essays, and travel tips, as well as personalized travel advice from me. Again, you can find the link to our Substack page in the show notes. Thanks so much for your support. It's more vital than you may realize, especially in a moment when AI and other factors are making it increasingly challenging for writers like me to make a living from their creative endeavors. Now, without further ado, let's get to Edith Piaf, Part 2. I'm going to begin today's episode with the same caveat I opened the last one with. I won't be presenting a laundry list of Edith Piaf's many love affairs here, because I don't think that's what makes her interesting or worth remembering, even though her supposed obsession with love has been the focus of countless books and biopics. I also won't be attempting to cover every phase of her career and life, which would be an impossible feat and probably make for a droning and boring listen anyway. Instead, in this episode, we'll be focusing on a few key phases and turning points in Piaf's life, especially pivotal moments in her musical artistry and the collaborations that made those pivots possible. You'll also learn a bit about her appearances in theater and films. Piaf was a talented theatrical performer, but this aspect of her career hasn't typically received that much attention. Yet she moved with remarkable ease between concert halls, stages, and film sets, and I think she could have had a formidable career as an actor had she wanted one. We ended our last episode in 1939, when France was on the brink of war with Germany and the world was about to enter a period of unprecedented horror. Piaf's relationship with Raymond Asso, the lyricist who would later claim to have invented the singer, but whose controlling partner behavior stifled her, would pretty much come to an end when he was called to war that August. They exchanged letters in the years that followed, but things would never be the same. Edith was now 23 years old and coming into a sense of her own power and agency that would show both in her performances and in how she managed her career. While she would have other mentors and business managers throughout her life, it's probably safe to say that no one else would again control her life, finances, and public image in the same ways that she had let Asso, Louis Leplay, and others do up until this point. And as we'll learn a bit later, rather than letting others claim to fashion her in their image, she would start to make a point of mentoring others, especially talented young male musicians, including one named Charles Aznavour, later to become a major French chanson star in his own right. The tables would decidedly be turned. While war raged elsewhere in Europe, it seemed remote to most people in Paris, at least until Hitler attacked France and the country surrendered in June 1940. In 1939, it was still considered a phony war, with armies mobilized in anticipation of attacks from Germany, but no actual fighting yet taking place. There were, however, some prisoners of war, and during this period, Edith starred in a benefit show in honor of French prisoners at a club in Paris, where soldiers on leave were often in the audience. According to Carolyn Burke, author of the biography No Regrets, Piaf performed songs such as Le Fagnon de la Légion and other patriotic fare at the show. But for her, like for most Parisians, the war continued to feel abstract. Later that year, she met a young singer named Paul Meurice, who quickly became enamored with her after seeing her perform. Within a couple of months, they had moved in together. The bourgeois Paul managed to snag them a furnished Parisian apartment near the Champs-Élysées that must have seemed palatial to Edith. They had a cook, cleaner, personal secretary, and even a grand piano. This was the first time Piaf had lived in surroundings that looked like something akin to bourgeois respectability, and interestingly, La Môme de Belleville would never again live in eastern Paris, making her home in the well-to-do West for the rest of her life. Meurice and their shared apartment may well have been her gateway drug of sorts to a life of greater outward comfort, even though Piaf was terrible with money and perpetually in debt. In her relationship with Paul Meurice, Edith played the mentor, at least musically. Meurice was astounded by Piaf's work ethic, and she pushed him to elevate his own act by adding some comic and theatrical elements. This would serve him well in his later acting career. And while their relationship only lasted a few short months, it led Piaf to channel her talents into an entirely new medium, the theater. Living together wasn't exactly a success. Edith, of her own admission, harangued Paul with constant recriminations. Paul, who was a classic avoidant personality, would do his best to ignore Edith's verbal assaults by hiding behind a newspaper or book, lounging on the bed in his dressing gown. Edith's friend, Jean Cocteau, caught wind of all this and thought it would make an excellent scenario for the theater, so he dashed off a one-act play he called Le Bel Indifférent, or The Handsome Indifferent One, referring, of course, to Paul. Cocteau invited Edith and Paul to perform the roles themselves in a play that might be described as a light-hearted Gallic predecessor to Albee's Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. It played to packed audiences in Paris, partly because Piaf had by this time become a big name. The French press roundly praised her performance, and she had all the lines since it was a ranting monologue. But it wasn't Edith who would go on to be known primarily as an actor. It was Paul, who appeared in dozens of French films and plays over the course of his career. For now, though, he'd have to content himself with a supporting role to Piaf's rising star. In 1941, just a year into the Nazi occupation of Paris, Edith and Paul both appeared in a romantic comedy called Montmartre sur Seine, directed by Georges Lacombe. In the film, which was Piaf's debut in a starring role on screen, Piaf plays the semi-autobiographical Lily, a florist with a powerful singing voice who lives a bohemian life in Montmartre. She's caught up in a romantic triangle with two men, Michel and Maurice, played by Jean-Louis Borot and Henri Vidal. Paul Meurice was cast in a supporting role as Paul, a member of the Montmartre art scene of which Lily is a part. Over the course of the film, Lily gains fame singing in the streets and quickly becomes a noted cabaret singer. Piaf and her composer Marguerite Monod worked on the score together, and the film was used as a clever platform for more effectively disseminating some of Piaf's most popular early songs, including J'ai dansé avec l'amour and Tu es partout. The film was generally well received by Parisian critics, but this was 1941, and all forms of culture were subject to scrutiny from the Gestapo and from the pro-Nazi French press. According to Burke, a critic writing in the collaborationist newspaper Je suis partout with its Orwellian title I Am Everywhere, wrote that although the film was, quote, untainted by Jewish actors, Piaf's presence was nevertheless disturbing, even freakish. He snivelingly referred to her as, quote, that little person with cavernous eyes, a macabre big head tucked into her hunched shoulders. Another pro-Nazi critic from Révolution Nationale called Piaf, quote, the perfect incarnation of our decadent era, referring to the Hitlerian obsession with so-called decadent art, or the artists who offended Aryan aesthetic and moral values. Montmartre sur Seine would ultimately not be banned, but it's fascinating to look back at how its reception, including around Edith's performance and physical presence, was partly colored by Nazi ideology. Let's now get back to the development of Piaf's musical oeuvre during the early years of the war, and specifically the story of her first song to sell over 1 million copies. That song was L'Accordéoniste, one I find to be among her most haunting, complex, and clever. L'Accordéoniste was written, both music and lyrics, by a Russian-born musician named Michel Aimère in early 1940. This was only a few months before Hitler marched under the Arc de Triomphe. Michel Aimère reportedly offered his new song to Piaf the night before he was scheduled to join the war effort. Or, according to a different account, he had gone AWOL, but was about to head back to his post. They had met a year before, but Piaf reportedly found Aimère's songs too sentimental, even sappy. One night, he showed up beneath her window, shouted her name, and said he had a new song for her, but she refused to let him up, telling him to fuck off. In an interview with David Brett, Aimère himself recalled shouting back, "And if I'm killed, madame, you'll have missed out on one of the best songs you never had the patience to listen to." She apparently relented. After hearing him play the first few bars of the song from another room, Piaf rushed in and listened to the rest of the song. "Formidable, I'll sing it at the Bobino premiere," Aimère recalls Piaf saying, noting that he was horrified since the show was scheduled for the following evening. They worked through the night on the song, and the rest is history. It marked the beginning of a close friendship and collaboration, but they wouldn't work on another song together until after the end of World War II. Aimère delayed leaving for duty for a day, allowing him to watch Piaf perform L'Accordéoniste for the first time on February 16th at the Bobino Theatre in Montparnasse. The song tells the story of a fille de joie, a prostitute, who falls in love with an accordionist. He plays the java for her, which is music meant to accompany a faster, more sensual version of a waltz, and she falls in love, perhaps as much with the music as with him. She's entranced by the java, and it transports her to a different world, one in which she might have a better life by the side of the accordéoniste. But then her beloved leaves for war and never returns, leaving the fille de joie in a desperate state. Sa vie est foutue, her life is over. She returns to the life of the streets, but still goes to the music hall and listens to the java to forget her miserable life. At the end of the song, perhaps remembering the death of her love, she cries out in despair, "Arrêtez la musique! Stop the music!" She can no longer escape the pain of loss. This is pure chanson réaliste in its basic storytelling, another sad story about a prostitute, and the utter impossibility for a wretched, morally depraved working-class woman to achieve anything like real social mobility, much less happiness. It's defeatist, pessimistic, and lachrymose, like so many other songs in the genre. So nothing new there, really. But the poetic tension created both by the lyrics and by Piaf's strongly accented, powerful singing, including a despairing a cappella at the end of the song, make it particularly powerful. This is an instance where I really wish I could play you at least part of the song or even quote the lyrics in French. But as I explained in my first episode on Piaf, copyright laws around music are too strict to risk it. I encourage you to go listen to the song, though, whether now or later. I've created a Spotify playlist with all the songs I mention in these 2 episodes, which you'll find in the show notes. For me, the contrast between the stanzas, played in a gloomy minor key and sung with a despair as thick as molasses, and the chorus, which turns to a jaunty major key and perfectly translates the joy and imaginative release the prostitute feels as she dances to the java, is what makes the song so compelling. This is my translation in English of some of the lines, which I hope gives you an idea of the spirit of the song, despite lacking the satisfying rhyme and rhythm of the original. She hears the java, but she doesn't dance it, nor even glance at the dance floor, and her amorous eyes follow the nervous playing and the long, thin hands of the artist. It gets into her skin from the low to the high. She wants to sing, it's kinetic. Her whole being is tensed, her breath in suspense. She's a real freak for the music. Piaf bellows the last line of the chorus and places a lengthy E note on the last word, musique. that seems to suggest the dizzying frenzy experienced by the fille de joie. She loudly growls other words in the chorus, making me think that before there was Tom Waits, there was Piaf, performing in a way that would certainly not be associated with delicate femininity, whether then or now. The wild success of L'Accordéoniste is a major part of Piaf's wartime legacy. Owing to the song's author, it also serves as an important symbol for those who argue that Piaf engaged in meaningful acts of resistance against the Nazi occupiers. Michel Aimère, who was born Aimère Rosenstein and was Jewish, had departed to serve in the French army. But after June 1940 and the defeat of France at the hands of Nazi Germany, his life was now in grave danger. According to numerous accounts, Piaf helped him go into hiding in unoccupied France by sending him money. Some even say she sent him the royalties he had been owed but had not been able to receive because of new laws that banned Jewish artists from receiving royalties. While it would eventually net Piaf millions of sales, L'Accordéoniste was, according to Burke, banned from the airways and cabarets of occupied France. But Piaf did perform it during the period anyway, notably in January 1943. She was apparently warned by the Propaganda-Staffel, the Nazi-controlled service charged with censoring non-Aryan and so-called decadent cultural content, to no longer play L'Accordéoniste and other songs written by Aimère, since he was Jewish. She refused, and she was banned from performing for 3 months. This all leads us to wade into one of the thornier debates about Piaf and the World War II years. Was she a true resistance figure who hated Hitler and everything the Nazis stood for, including their anti-Semitism? Or was she what you might call a soft collaborationist, someone who wasn't too bothered by the occupation in her day-to-day life and even benefited from it in certain ways, even as she helped Jewish friends she deeply cared about? There's very little consensus on this question. Some biographers, including David Brett, maintain that she was a true résistante, even if she didn't engage in spying or other truly life-threatening activities, as people including Josephine Baker had. We'll be hearing more about Baker's fight against Nazism in our next episode. The image of Piaf as a resistance hero is so prevalent that the musician Martha Wainwright released an album of covers in 2009, and while on tour repeatedly described Piaf as, quote, a great supporter of la résistance. But other historians, including Robert Belleret and David Loosely, see Piaf's wartime years as ones that she generally benefited from, notably because the Nazi occupiers were big fans of her music, and because the radio now reached millions of people in their homes. It's no secret that it was during the war years that Piaf genuinely cemented her fame, becoming a household name in France and much of Europe. So shouldn't it be reasonable to conclude that she benefited from the occupation? In a piece for the BBC, the historian Catherine Franck argues that the truth is somewhere in the middle. In her reckoning, Piaf should neither be viewed as a hero of the French resistance nor as a collaborationist villain. The truth is more ambiguous. Quoting Piaf's friend and sometimes lover Henri Conté, Burke describes this ambiguity. Quote, though Piaf detested the occupiers, she had to go on singing to earn her keep and because she could not do otherwise. On the one hand, her friend Henri Conté explained, she felt an instinctive hatred of the Krauts. On the other, she was hardly bothered by the occupation. End quote. What can be said is that Piaf did defy the Gestapo and their cultural arm on numerous occasions, despite an obligation to check in with the Propaganda-Staffel at their office on the Champs-Élysées in order to have her songs vetted before being played on the airways. She fell afoul of the Nazi propaganda laws more than a few times during the war, including through her aforementioned performances of Aimère's songs. And in 1941, she also co-wrote and released a song with Marguerite Monod called Où sont-ils mes petits copains? Where are all my little friends? She first performed it in 1942 under the watchful eye of the Propaganda-Staffel, who no doubt would have noticed the defiant tone of the lyrics written by Piaf herself. This is my translation of a bit of the song. Where are they, all my pals, who left this morning for war? Where are they, all those little boys who sang, "We're coming back, don't fret"? Piaf managed to get away with a slap on the wrist for lighting the stage in the colors of the tricolor flag, but audience members may well have caught the songs hinting at the future return of the, quote, real France, one freed from German occupation. Alongside these subtler acts of resistance, Piaf also helped several of her Jewish friends flee by providing logistical and financial assistance during the war years. This fact more clearly evidences her willingness to take risks that might have endangered her personally. After all, in both occupied northern France and in the so-called free zone of Vichy, where the Marshal Pétain led a pro-Nazi government, hiding or materially aiding Jews was considered a criminal offense that was punishable by deportation, imprisonment, or even execution. None of this would have been taken lightly, even by the sometimes naive Piaf. In 1941, Piaf was deepening her professional and personal relationship with Norbert Glansberg, a German Jewish pianist and composer who'd once played with Django Reinhardt in Paris. Glansberg accompanied Piaf on tour in the unoccupied zone, where the government of Vichy France had not yet passed its most violent laws targeting Jews. Still pursuing a tumultuous relationship with Paul Meurice, Edith seems to have turned her affections to Glansberg around this time, and their musical collaboration would survive the war, with Glansberg eventually writing popular songs for her such as Padam Padam. He'd also write songs for other chanson artists like Charles Trenet. According to several sources, Piaf became a lifeline to Glansberg once new anti-Semitic laws denied him the proceeds from his song rights. And it would only be a few months before Jews were banned from appearing on entertainment programs altogether. Glansberg adopted an alias and managed to secure a fake passport. By 1942, thousands of Jews were being rounded up around France and deported by train to death camps eastward. In May of that year, Jews in the occupied zone were ordered to start wearing yellow stars. Newspapers were full of headlines warning of the so-called Jewish menace to society, in what sadly turned out to be a pretty effective brainwashing campaign. But as Burke notes, most French people, especially in the occupied North, were less preoccupied by the plight of their Jewish neighbors and more focused on how to eat, get around, and stay warm through power outages. Food rationing meant access to even basic staples like milk and bread was punishingly limited, and contrary to popular national myths of a French population that was broadly resistant to the Nazis, most people put their heads down and focused on their own survival, even if they weren't always enthusiastic collaborators. As conditions became even more dangerous throughout a divided France, Piaf grew increasingly worried about her Jewish friends, including Glansberg. He was arrested in May 1943, according to Loosely, and was on the verge of being deported to a concentration camp when he was released, likely through a bribe arranged by two of Piaf's friends, and with her financial assistance. Piaf then arranged a hiding place for him in Marseille, with the help of her secretary André Bigard. Bigard, also known as Dédé, and her family also helped hide other friends with Piaf's financial assistance, such as the French film director Marcel Blisten. Piaf went on to secure hiding places for Nono, as she affectionately called Glansberg, in a chateau outside of Marseille, then in Nice. She tried at one point to smuggle him back to Paris, writing him a letter declaring that he was her seul amour, her only love, despite the fact that she was also involved with lyricist Henri Conté at the time. One of the central facts that some have used to qualify Piaf as a soft collaborationist was her agreement to tour Germany a couple of times in 1943, supposedly proving that she was cozying up to the Nazis. It's true that she may have helped to lend them more legitimacy by agreeing to the tours, and she apparently even accepted an invitation to meet the propaganda czar Goebbels at one point, a meeting that never ended up happening, according to Loosely. Edith later maintained that she went to Germany only to help lift the spirits of the forced laborers who made up her audiences, and denied ever playing in German clubs or cabarets during the tours. Several biographers contend that Piaf took photos of some of the prisoners under the pretext of gathering personal souvenirs from the tour, but then handed them over to friends and acquaintances involved in the French resistance, who created fake passports for the prisoners. With the help of Edith and her secretary André Bigard, who had become an avowed member of La Résistance, the passports would be delivered to the prisoners along with maps and compasses, and they escaped by passing as members of Piaf's entourage. After the war, Piaf said that she had helped free 118 prisoners through the scheme. But others say this number was likely inflated. According to Loosely, Bigard herself said it was a more modest several dozen who were freed in this way. And the Piaf biographer Robert Belleret is skeptical that these rescue missions ever happened at all, noting that there were no testimonies from POWs themselves. Nevertheless, there are enough independent accounts of the operation to suggest that it likely did happen and that Edith was involved, even as some continue to maintain that it's all the stuff of myth. After the liberation of Paris in August 1945, Piaf was suspected as a Nazi collaborator and called before a panel to defend her actions during the war. Her trips to Germany were scrutinized, and so was her acquaintance with a certain General Vector, a right-hand man to Goebbels, who greatly admired Piaf's music. He was the one who had tried to arrange for her to meet the propaganda goon. The fact that she had lived for 2 years above a brothel on the Champs-Élysées that was frequented by members of the Gestapo also didn't exactly help her case. She had apparently opened her apartment to allow fans to watch her rehearse in her apartment, including Nazi officers on several occasions. However, some sources claim that her landlady, the brothel owner known as Madame Billy, hid Jews and members of the resistance, as Nazis drank and danced just below in the bar. If this was true, Piaf would have known about it and denounced no one. Unlike other chansons françaises stars of the period, including Miss Dinguette, Charles Trenet, and Maurice Chevalier, Piaf was only temporarily blacklisted from the airwaves after the war. While she was under investigation by the panel, her secretary André Bigard testified in her favor, corroborating her story about freeing French POWs. And after she told the panel about her efforts to hide and financially aid Glansberg and other Jewish friends, she was exonerated and later even honored by the state for her wartime efforts. In an interview with the magazine Ce Soir that appeared shortly after her exoneration, Piaf said that she and other entertainers had been forced to comply with the occupiers. Quote, "I forced myself to navigate around the pitfalls of the Nazi propaganda machine to keep the trust of the French public," Burke quotes her as saying in the interview, a statement that's unnervingly ambiguous, maybe willfully so. As with so many aspects of Piaf's life, when it comes to the World War II years, we'll probably never know exactly where facts bleed into exaggeration or even outright myths. Just as France would go on to fabricate the myth of its wide-scale resistance to German occupation, public figures like Piaf were strongly incentivized to paint themselves as fervent patriots and to underplay or deny any instances of collaboration with the German invaders. To do otherwise would have cost them not only their careers, but possibly their lives. Despite Piaf's ordeal of being suspected as a collaborator, 1944 was generally a strong year for her career. She had recently passed an exam that gave her official credentials as a lyricist, and she started penning the lyrics for more of her own songs, including La Vie en Rose. Even though she wouldn't record it for another 2 years, it would, as we discussed in Piaf Part 1, become one of her best-known songs, selling millions of copies worldwide. Her personal life was, once again, marked by an exciting new collaboration turned romance. Although she had lost her beloved father to lung cancer early in the year, she would soon find another temporary daddy figure in Yves Montand, despite being several years her junior. She met Montand, an Italian-born Marseillais who still crooned with remnants of a southern French accent, after she was hired to sing at the recently reopened Moulin Rouge. She in turn hired him to accompany her, and they began working on material together. She even asked her lyricist Henri Conté, with whom she was still involved romantically, to help her write new material for Montand. in yet another example of Piaf's inability to compartmentalize her relationships. For her, passionate collaboration often meant stirring tensions, and that included inciting juicy dramas by making her current lovers come face-to-face with those that would soon replace them. Since she most often formed relationships with men who were first her professional collaborators, messy overlaps were pretty much inevitable. Piaf made it her project to transform Montaigne's image and vocal style, encouraging him to drop what loosely calls the, quote, ludicrous cowboy persona he had initially adopted against the background of post-liberation Americanophilia. She also pushed Montaigne to get involved in film acting, as she had Paul Meurice. Montaigne would indeed become a movie star and also a huge chanson star in his own right. The new couple became a press item when they began performing together in Marseille. A flock of journalists came to see them play and were enamored by Piaf's tall, charismatically handsome new partner with Yankee airs. There, the duo announced that they'd soon be appearing in a month-long show at the Étoile Theatre in Paris. Their relationship fizzled out after a few months, but from all counts, it was a passionate one. A New York Times piece from 1981 quotes Montaigne as he bitterly recalls their affair.
"We had only 1 year of love life. She was exceptional when she sang, but in life, she could be bitchy and she could be captivating. One was never bored."
From the beginning of their professional collaboration, there was a risk that the charismatic, tall, and handsome Montaigne would outshine Piaf, whether musically or through his compelling stage presence. After a joint performance at the Casino Montparnasse, according to Burke, the audience applauded Montaigne's own repertoire so loudly that the press started to speculate that he might become a bigger star than his mentor. This was evidently a problem for Piaf. Many claim she broke up the relationship because she was envious of Montaigne's rising star. And in this particular case, it seems to have been Montaigne who was left heartbroken by the end of their affair, as he related in an interview with The Times.
"All the men she loved, she left. She was never left. For me, it was one of the most beautiful years of my life, and I was terribly hurt."
This is a stunningly vulnerable admission from the mid-century French hunk who would go on to have an affair with Marilyn Monroe and marry the film star Simone Signoret. Still, their year together was fruitful from a professional standpoint. Just as she had with Paul Meurice, Edith starred in a film with Montaigne, possibly her most compelling role, in her friend Marcel Blisten's Étoile sans lumière, or Star Without Light. Released in 1946 and written by Blisten while he was hiding during the war, with Piaf's financial assistance, let's not forget, the film is an uncanny precursor to Singin' in the Rain, at least from a standpoint of plot. The film, which is available on YouTube, stars Piaf as Madeleine, a maid who gets through her workdays by singing, and Montaigne as her auto mechanic boyfriend Pierre, a strong, silent, and reliable working-class masculine archetype. He supports Madeleine and follows her to Paris when she's offered the chance of a lifetime to lend her voice to a new film. But a bit like the naive Betty/Diane in David Lynch's Mulholland Drive, Madeleine's misty dreams of stardom on the big screen give way to a grim reality, one that sees her exploited and upstaged for the benefit of a silent screen star named Stella Dora. It's 1929, the talkie era has arrived, and Stella Dora can't sing. The solution? Getting the chambermaid Madeleine, who maintains in an early scene that to be happy she has to sing, to record songs for the film, then have Stella Dora dub them over. Madeleine, the titular Star Without Light, ends up getting zero credit for her work on the film. She finds out that her voice has been dubbed over by Stella Dora during the premiere and quickly becomes disillusioned. Later, Stella is bribed by another cast member who has knowledge of the scheme and dies in a car accident, perhaps by suicide. Madeleine is encouraged to sing in front of a live audience at the end of the film, but she's seized by stage fright and runs out of the theater. She won't perform after all, thus remaining unseen and unknown. Released 6 years before Singin' in the Rain, it's hard to imagine that Étoile sans lumière didn't serve, at the very least, as an unconscious source text for the American musical from Gene Kelly and Stanley Donen. Of course, the Technicolor Hollywood musical would have none of the existential angst and pessimism of Blisten's film, which perfectly aligns with the fatalist tradition of the chanson réaliste. The poor working-class woman's dreams could not be realized. That Piaf herself, the film's star, comes from a working-class background evidently couldn't persuade the writer to give Madeleine a path to even modest success. In addition to getting audiences' eyeballs on Piaf without having to fork out money for a ticket to one of her concerts, Étoile sans lumière was an efficient vehicle for promoting more recent songs, such as C'était une histoire d'amour, written by Jean Jalle with lyrics by Henri Conté. Yves Montand also sings in what was his debut film, giving a huge boost to his own career in chanson. Other songs featured in the movie, such as Le Chant du Pirate or Pirate Song, didn't end up becoming hits, but showcased the talents of Conté as lyricist and Marguerite Monod as composer during this crucial period of Piaf's career. 1946 was a profile-raising year for Piaf in other ways, aside from her appearance on the big screen. That year, she left Polydor, her longtime record label, and joined Pate Marconi. As a subsidiary of EMI, her new label had a more global reach and could accommodate her shift to working with a whole orchestra. In Piaf Part 1, we discuss some of Edith's years performing with the Compagnons, including a close look at her New York debut in 1947. So we're now going to skip ahead a few years to the mid-1950s. The years in between have been generally discussed elsewhere, including Piaf's ill-fated love affair with the boxing champion Marcel Cerdan, his death in a plane crash, and Piaf's subsequent health problems and prescription drug addiction. If you're interested in getting a deeper look at this period in her life, I encourage you to read Burke's biography in particular, alongside Loosely's cultural history of Piaf's musical legacy. In early 1955, Edith was 39 years old. She had conquered global audiences, especially in the English-speaking world, and a year earlier she sold her millionth record, a fact that was feted by her record label with a lavish reception. She'd co-written over 25 songs with Marguerite Monod, her longtime composer and friend, and she'd also come into her own as a lyricist. She'd mentored and boosted the careers of rising chanson stars like Charles Aznavour, who was also a devoted friend, and who performed with her and co-wrote songs with her. You might say that she'd found a sort of stable family of her own choosing, where she'd lacked one as a child. By this time, it was Edith Piaf who'd become a global icon of Frenchness, not Damia, Mistinguett, or other earlier stars of la chanson réaliste whom she'd once emulated. By this time, people associated Piaf with a sort of quintessential Frenchness, as readily as they did baguettes, brie, or berets. Yet the late 1940s and early 1950s had also been marked by personal tragedy, not least the loss of Cerdan, whom she considered the great love of her life. Some say Cerdan's untimely death shortened Piaf's own life by plunging her into depression and a growing dependency on prescription drugs and alcohol to numb the pain. It wasn't just heartbreak that plagued her, though. Piaf had also developed a serious case of rheumatoid arthritis sometime in the early 1950s that left her with chronic pain in her hands and arms, which from then on appeared somewhat disfigured. And in 1951, she broke ribs and an arm in a car accident with Charles Aznavour, who was a fellow passenger. Bizarrely, she'd go on to survive several more serious car accidents, another with Aznavour just a month later, a third accident in 1958 with her then-lover Georges Moustaki, and a fourth a year later with another boyfriend, Douglas Davies. Each took an additional toll on her body, leading to bouts of hospitalization, and her increasing use of drugs like morphine to address the pain. Her supposed half-sister Simone Berthaud, or Momone, claims that in addition to morphine, Piaf was also hooked on the needle during this period. But then Berthaud has hardly been known as a reliable narrator. Other biographers maintain that Piaf, in fact, loathed drugs, having seen her own mother succumb to them at just 49 years old. But Edith's longtime alcohol abuse, which at the time would not necessarily have been recognized as a drug addiction in and of itself, certainly dealt serious blows to her already fragile health. "1955 opened with Piaf's first run at the Olympia Theatre in Paris, the venue where she would perform many times until her death in 1963, and which would forever be associated with her. This was especially true because audiences tended to give in to the emotional spectacle and visceral experience of Piaf, who at 39 was prematurely aged by illness and addiction. With her stooped back, hands bent by arthritis, thinning hair and tiny frame, she looked even more like a wounded bird. So hearing a coarse yet still powerful voice emerge from this frail woman had an emotional effect on people that was hard to suppress. Reviewing her first Olympia run, an article in French newspaper Le Monde from February 1955 described Piaf in mysterious, almost saintly terms. This is my translation. Quote, "White and black, tinier than ever, Edith Piaf has never seemed so grand. The words one might apply to her, talent, art, genius, dissolve in the face of her mystery and her craft. Whatever she sings, whatever she does, the smallest note, the smallest gesture, seem as essential as they are unexpected, as irreplaceable as they are overflowing." End quote. While the French press would continue to be obsessed with Piaf as a tragic figure, minutely tracking her hospitalizations, illnesses, failed relationships, and the like, from this period onward, she'd also gained something like saintly status. She was a national icon, untouchable and irreproachable. Whatever she did, whatever she sang, it seemed as essential as the air, as this critic suggests. Despite her recent successes in France, Edith was suffering from exhaustion and decided, according to Burke, to, quote, "take it easy in America," which for this workaholic, of course, meant more touring. She and her then-husband, Jacques Pils, departed in March of 1955, first taking their new show, entitled Edith Piaf and Her Continental Review, to California, then to Chicago, the East Coast, and Montreal. Perhaps again adapting to American tastes for grand spectacles, the show featured a mime, acrobats, and a troupe of dancers, as well as her husband, who had adapted the stage name Jacques Pils. Pills didn't sound good in English. A critic from the San Francisco Chronicle proclaimed that Piaf was, quote, "France's greatest gift to theater since Sarah Bernhardt." This was another successful moment of adaptation for Piaf, who was by now fluent in English and charmed audiences with spirited, often funny introductions to the 12 songs she'd perform alongside her ensemble each night. These songs included Ima l'amour, which she'd co-written as an ode to her lost love Marcel Cerdan, J'étais dans la peau, Je n'en connais pas la fin, and La vie en rose, of course. The program noticeably lacked some of her grittier chansons réalistes. Again, this was America, where full-throated love songs were more appreciated than tales of wretched prostitutes or of illicit affairs with legionnaires and sailors. She performed at Carnegie Hall for the first time in 1956, then returned in 1957, this time with a set list that included a few weightier ballads, such as L'accordéoniste and La goulante du pauvre Jean. The latter song best known for its line, Sans amour on n'est rien du tout. Without love, one is nothing at all. A New York Times critic reviewing the January 1956 show at the Carnegie Hall opened his piece this way. Edith Piaf, high priestess of agony, drenched Carnegie Hall in tears last night, and a large audience wallowed in them with an enthusiasm which proved that heartbreak makes the world kin. Sometimes, it would seem, Piaf forced her American audiences to confront darker emotions, to cathartic effect. In September of 1956, Piaf kicked off her 6th round of shows at the Versailles Club in New York City, and celebrities including Marilyn Monroe and Charlie Chaplin were in the audience. Returning to Paris in late 1956, Piaf was struggling both to keep her marriage to Jacques Piels afloat and to maintain a sense of artistic relevancy amid a new crop of French chanson stars, from Juliette Greco to Jacques Brel, Georges Brassens, and even her close friend Charles Aznavour. She worried that she'd become a sort of symbol for the French nation, ossified and no longer seen as fresh. So she started to work on updating her repertoire with songs that would be perceived as having a sort of jaunty Americanness, during a time when the Yankees across the pond were seen as innovative and edgy. This included songs like L'homme à la moto, or The Man on the Motorcycle, whose protagonist is a James Dean-like rebel without a cause. Piaf also worked hard studying what made new chanson stars like Brel and Brassens so appealing to audiences, including their gritty social realism melded with irony and a very French brand of wit. She tried to infuse her own repertoire with a sense of post-war modernity, but I'm not convinced that it worked. Most continued to perceive her as the symbol of a glamorous pre-war Paris and its quaint dance halls. But they also revered her as the reigning queen of chanson. So maybe she didn't need to convince anyone of her youthfulness or modernity. In 1957, Piaf embarked on yet another tour of North America, but was again suffering from physical and mental exhaustion and expressed a desire to close friends to slow down and take a break. But did she take one? Bien sûr que non. Of course not. She doubled down instead, performing at Carnegie Hall despite suffering from a high fever and bronchitis. She played in pre-Castro Havana, where she hobnobbed with Hemingway fans and was given full-star treatment. Then, after returning to France, she did another series of shows at the Olympia. But Piaf was chronically unwell, and her marriage to Jacques Piels ended in divorce in 1957. This is something her friend Marlene Dietrich, who was maid of honor at Piaf's wedding to Piels in 1952, would have applauded. Dietrich recalled her profound, immediate dislike for Piels in an interview with David Brett. In particular, she blamed Piels for Edith's deepening dependence on drugs to counter her rheumatoid arthritis. Quote, "He knew what she was doing, but he did nothing to stop her because his career was finished and she was paying for everything. I told her, get rid of that son of a bitch and find yourself a real husband." End quote. Despite Piaf's continuing health issues and failed marriage, 1957 was a fruitful year artistically. She appeared in another film by Marcel Blisten, Les Amants de Demain, The Lovers of Tomorrow, and she recorded one of her most interesting and mesmerizing songs, La Foule, or The Crowd. Adapted from a 1936 Peruvian waltz called Que nadie sepa mi sufrir, Let No One Know My Suffering, the song caught Piaf's attention when she heard it while touring in Argentina. One of her lyricists, Michel Rivegauche, wrote new lyrics for the song, imagining a woman who's lost in an enormous crowd. She falls in love with a stranger there, but is eventually separated from him by the crushing mass of bodies. It's a strangely hypnotic song, one that I can't help returning to, despite the fact that accordion players on the Paris Metro play it so often and so badly that they almost ruined it for me. As with many of Piaf's songs, it's the chorus that I find most compelling and haunting, with her characteristic rolled R's emphasizing a sense of dizziness suggested by the lyrics themselves. My translation, of course, lacks those poetic rolling R's, but here's a bit to show you how the lyrics create a sense of frenzied vertigo. Carried by the crowd that drags us, that pulls us, crushed against us, we form a single body, and the effortless flow pushes us, chains us together, and leaves us both blissful, radiant, and happy. "1958 and 1959 were marked by a head-spinning number of engagements for Piaf, including at the Olympia, where she performed nearly 130 shows in a single year. But Piaf's body couldn't keep up, and she collapsed on stage several times. Her worst car accident yet in 1958 left her even frailer, and in 1959 she was hospitalized for numerous ailments, including a bad bout of pancreatitis. The press churned out articles speculating that Edith's days may have been numbered, and her summer 1959 tour was frequently referred to as her suicide tour. Piaf's growing interest in Rosicrucian ideas, which blended Christian mysticism with ideas vaguely drawn from the Kabbalah and other esoteric spiritual concepts, likely led her to believe that her mental force and determination would allow her to overcome her health problems, however dire. "What the doctors never understand is that I always get well because of my moral strength," she told a journalist. By 1960, Edith's health had gotten even worse, and she was told by a doctor that if she didn't stop working and performing, she would die. But she refused to stop singing, writing, and performing, famously telling at least one interviewer, "If I don't sing, I die." Nevertheless, she was forced that year to cancel her summer tour and sell her country house so she could pay off medical bills. While her friend Bruno Coquetrix, the owner of the Olympia Club, asked her to perform in another series of shows in October 1960, she initially declined, despite Coquetrix's plea to help save his venue from financial ruin. But she changed her mind when she met the man who would compose the most memorable songs of her final years, Charles Dumont. Piaf had insulted Dumont in the past, and he wasn't initially a friend, according to a 2006 documentary called The Last Days of Edith Piaf. It can also be found in full on YouTube. Dumont revisited a song that he had written a few years earlier with his lyricist Michel Vauquer. They returned to it in 1960, and Vauquer, penning a new lyric, thought it would be a perfect fit for Piaf. In the documentary, Dumont recalls that Vauquer came up with an opening lyric and title for the song, which started with a long initial note, "Non, je ne regrette rien." Dumont told Vauquer he didn't like the idea at all, to which he replied, "Don't worry, it's a good title and it's a song for Edith Piaf." Then, Dumont recalls, he said, "Please, I beg you, Michel, whatever you want, whomever you want, I'll go to the ends of the earth, but not Piaf. It's just not possible." Perhaps he had heard rumors of Piaf insulting him, or was aware that she was exacting and demanding with her collaborators, as divas are wont to be. But Dumont would not, as we know now, get his way, and their collaboration would end up changing both their professional lives in major ways. In an interview with David Brett, Dumont recalled his first meeting with Piaf at her Paris apartment on Boulevard Lannes. Quote, "When Piaf came into the room, she looked a fright. She was wearing a nightdress several sizes too big for her, odd carpet slippers, and she hardly had any hair. And she was so rude, telling me to play my song and get it over with, and then clear off." End quote. But as soon as Dumont played her the song, she completely changed her attitude. Dumont remembered it this way, quote, "As if by magic, all the lines of illness seemed to drop off her face, and her attitude changed towards me alarmingly. Then it was as if we'd been friends her whole life." Non, je ne regrette rien went on to become Piaf's greatest commercial success globally, and she'd record it in English as well. Interestingly, the song was also adopted by the French Foreign Legion as its sort of unofficial anthem during the Algerian War. This isn't exactly an honorable association, given how violently France tried to suppress Algerians' fight for independence against their colonial rulers. Piaf first performed the song live during her return to the Olympia in December 1960. And of course, this is a moment that's given central importance in Olivier Dahan's film, La Vie en Rose. It was treated as a star engagement, with tickets costing thousands of francs and thus not really accessible to your average Parisian. Nevertheless, even the elite ticket holders had to wait outside for hours to be let in, and they applauded for 15 minutes as they awaited Piaf's entrance onto the stage. She appeared in her worn black dress from Balmain, her thinned reddish hair styled to make it look a bit thicker, and started the show with a rendition of Les Mots d'Amour, a new song written by Dumont and Michel Rivegauche. She ended this show famously with Non, je ne regrette rien, and the orchestra punctuated the last line as she gestured at her audience. Ça commence avec toi. It starts with you. The applause was rapturous, and she made no fewer than 22 curtain calls that night. Coquetrix praised Piaf for saving the Olympia, and critics saw the show as evidence of Piaf's return from the brink. As one critic writing in Le Monde put it, quote, "It's more than a comeback, it's a resurrection. Edith Piaf has come back a long way. She's come back unchanged." While Piaf's return to the Olympia and her collaboration with Charles Dumont were bright spots in the early 1960s, she was devastated by the death of her longtime composer and close friend Marguerite Monod in October 1961. Piaf had pulled most of Monod's earlier songs from the program for the Olympia and replaced them with Dumont's newer ones, and she blamed herself in part for Monod's death. Monod had a ruptured appendix but had refused treatment, leading some to speculate that she had lost her will to live after Piaf pulled her songs. "As everyone knows, she was my best friend," Piaf told one journalist. "I won't even mention her talent. It's what helped me to be Edith Piaf." Over the following next couple of years, Piaf would tour and sing herself to the brink of death. At least that's the conclusion of many of her closest friends and confidants, who attested to her inability to stop working, no matter the cost. In and out of hospitals again, including for an abdominal ulcer that was likely the beginnings of a cancer that would take her life, Piaf was forced to take periods of convalescence between shows, and the press continued to speculate with each appearance on stage that it might be her last. Of course, she had several more wildly successful runs, including at the Olympia, and added several new songs to her repertoire. In early 1962, Claude Figus, one of Piaf's groupies and an aspiring performer, introduced her to a young Greek man named Theophanis Lamboukas. He first became her secretary, but the relationship quickly evolved. He was only 26 to her 46, but she married him the following year, rebaptizing him as Theo Sarapo, Sarapo meaning I love you in Greek. This would also become his stage name as Edith's latest protégé, joining her on stage for duets at the Olympia and other venues around France and Europe. The public response to their May-October marriage was less than positive. Some were repulsed by the fact that Piaf looked, and sometimes publicly acted, like she could have been Sarapo's mother. There was also the strong likelihood that Sarapo, like his friend Claude Figus, was gay, or at the least bisexual. Piaf did have a tendency, especially at the end of her life, to surround herself with adoring gay men. Some biographers speculate that companionship and not sexual intimacy was most important for her at this stage of her life. Many of Piaf's closest friends and collaborators, including Charles Dumont and Marlene Dietrich, have maintained that Sarapo genuinely loved her. Even the trash-talking Momone said in her posthumous memoir on Piaf that he wasn't with her for her money. After all, Piaf was in bad debt, and after her death, Sarapo would be responsible for paying it all off under French law. Despite public scrutiny of her marriage, Piaf would spend the last couple of years of her life with Sarapo, performing with him when she was strong enough and encouraging him to develop his own artistic voice. And from all counts, he was a devoted partner, including during her last months when he nursed a critically ill Piaf away from the prying eyes of journalists and critics. In 1963, the final year of her life, Piaf gathered enough strength to perform a few more times, first in Paris for a month-long run at the Bobino in Montparnasse. This time, her audience was likely composed of many ordinary Parisians, as the theater now mostly catered to the working classes. On some level, maybe, she had returned to her roots. On opening night, she performed 15 songs, some tried and true and some new. A February review in the New York Times noted her visible frailty, but also her improbable strength of presence. Quote, "For 50 minutes she poured out her heart and voice in song. Still of frail appearance, her hands twisted by arthritis, she uttered her defiance of the toil that illness had taken. Miss Piaf sang 15 songs, 8 of them new. They were songs of love and frustration, of happiness and sudden sadness, of sailors, of gigolos, and of girls of the street. With little gestures that were hardly gestures at all, she made each song come alive." End quote. Piaf's final show at the Bobino was on March 28th, but the last live performance of her life was at the Lille Opera House in northern France. Interestingly, there was a transport strike that day, so the Lille audience was likely small and intimate. In May, Theo Serapo and Piaf's entourage took her to a villa in Nice where she would convalesce for the next few months. She had a tour planned for the summer, but she would fall into several comas in the months that followed and never performed again. On the afternoon of October 10th, Piaf died of liver cancer after being transported 2 months earlier to another house in southern France. But her death wasn't announced until the morning after, and the press was falsely told she had died in Paris. In fact, Theo Serapo and Piaf's nurse had quietly arranged for an ambulance to transport her body overnight to the city of her birth, believing that Piaf wouldn't have wanted to officially pass away elsewhere. To the very end, her legacy would be tightly controlled and colored by myth. The day of her announced death, Jean Cocteau, devastated at the loss of his close friend, gave an impromptu radio eulogy in honor of Piaf. This excerpt is Burke's translation. Quote, "Like all those who live on in courage, she didn't think about death, she defied it. Only her voice remains, that splendid voice like black velvet that enhanced whatever she sang." Only hours later, Jean Cocteau himself died at 74. He had existing heart problems, but this didn't stop local paper Le Parisien Libéré to run a story with this headline: "The death of Edith Piaf killed Jean Cocteau." On the morning of her funeral, October 14th, 1963, almost 400,000 people assembled outside Edith's last Parisian home on Boulevard Lannes. It was here that Edith's body was readied for a funereal procession through the city, ending at the Père Lachaise cemetery, where she was to be buried. Traffic was completely blocked along the whole route of the procession, which stretched for several miles from western Paris to the northeast. "We didn't stop once on the way to Père Lachaise," said Piaf's last secretary, Daniel Bonnel, recalling the events through choked-back tears. And Charles Aznavour commented that it was the only time since the war that he'd seen Parisian traffic simply come to a halt. "People waited for hours and hours just to spend a second or two in front of her coffin," said Bernard Marchois, conservator of the Edith Piaf Museum in Paris. "The whole of Paris was in the street. It was a national funeral." Marchois recalled that there were some dreadful examples of crowd members misbehaving, frantically climbing over tombs or up into trees at Père Lachaise to get a glimpse of the funeral proceedings. But in the end, he said, Piaf was a Parisian, and Parisians came to pay homage to her. And in the years that followed her death, Piaf's iconic status would only balloon further, with tribute albums, unauthorized biographies and memoirs, biopics and tribute musicals, all either lionizing Edith, revealing new scandalous information about her, or trying to get at some secret essence that could only be revealed now that she was gone. Some speculated that Piaf had in effect taken her own life, in a sense, by giving in to her decline. She'd maintained that her life depended on being able to sing, but her steady physical decline over the last 2 or 3 years of her life made singing in public increasingly difficult, then finally impossible. Perhaps her extended health battles indeed lessened her will to go on. Maybe she drank more, took untold amounts of prescription and non-prescription drugs to ease the pain. Some say that's the case, while others say there's no real proof. But what we do know is that, from all accounts, she continued to love life. She performed, wrote and recorded music into the last few months of her own. She enjoyed the companionship and dedication of Theo Serapo, and of her loyal chosen family until her death. As I've tried to show in these 2 episodes, it was this chosen family that was probably her true passion. After music, that is. We've finally come to the end of our 2-part look at Edith Piaf, and I hope it's given you some new perspective, even if you're familiar with her life and work. You can find a full list of sources and suggestions for further reading/watching in the show notes. And please do go back and listen to the Spotify playlist I created for these 2 episodes if you haven't yet. Thanks so much for listening. I hope you'll tune in for part 4 of the Great French Icons of the 20th Century series, which will delve into the remarkable career and life of the Franco-American performer, spy, and war hero Josephine Baker. This episode was conceived, written, narrated, and edited by me, Courtney Traub. The producer was Brendan Whalen, who also contributed additional research, script editing, and voiceovers. Additional audio editing was from Engin Hassan of Edit Fade Warp. If you liked this episode, please follow us and share this episode as widely as you can. And as I mentioned earlier, you can also lend your precious support to the French Culture Podcast and Paris Unlocked by buying us a coffee, or even better, becoming a donor subscriber on Substack. Again, you'll find all the links in the show notes. Until next time, au revoir les amis.